The town was small, warm, and full of life. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and when one family laughed, the whole town laughed with them. When one family cried, the others came running with open arms. It was a place where love was not just a word, it was a way of life. Matthew and Elizabeth had grown up in this town. From the time they were children, their hands always found each other's. They walked to school together, played under the big mango tree near the river, and when they grew older, they dreamed together. Matthew was a strong man. He had always wanted to serve his country and protect the people he loved. Elizabeth was his other half, the calm in his storm, the light in his darkest days. She was kind, always smiling, and very beautiful. Their wedding was the kind people talked about for years. It was held in the most beautiful park in town, under the same tree they had played beneath as children. Elizabeth, radiant in her white dress, and Matthew, dashing in his military uniform, promised each other a lifetime of love and loyalty. The townsfolk cheered them on, convinced that their bond was unbreakable. The air smelled of fresh flowers, and the laughter of family and friends filled the air like music. It was a day of joy, of promises, of forever. Married life was everything they had dreamed of. Matthew worked hard as a military officer, sometimes leaving early in the morning and coming home late at night. But no matter how tired he was, he always found time to hold Elizabeth close, to whisper, "You are my home." Elizabeth took care of their home with love. She decorated their small house with colorful curtains, placed fresh flowers on the table every morning, and cooked Matthew's favorite meals. She waited for him by the door every evening, ready to welcome him with a warm embrace. People in town admired them. "That is love," they would say, "strong, unshakable, built to last." But even the strongest love can be tested. The morning was quiet, but in Matthew and Elizabeth's home, a heavy feeling filled the air. A letter had arrived the night before. Matthew was being deployed on a peacekeeping mission abroad. Elizabeth sat at the table, staring at the letter in his hands. She had always known this day would come. It was part of who Matthew was. A soldier, a protector, a man who wanted to serve his country. She had always admired that about him, but now that the moment was here, her heart ached. Matthew reached for her hand, his strong fingers wrapping around hers. "I have to go, Liz," he said softly. "This is what I was trained for." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She would never hold him back, never ask him to stay, even though every part of her wanted to. "I know," she whispered, "and I'll be right here waiting for you. Always." They spent the last few days together, cherishing every moment. Long walks in the park, quiet evenings under the stars, stolen kisses that felt deeper than before. And then, the day came. Elizabeth held on to him tightly at the station, burying her face in his chest, breathing him in one last time before he left. "Write to me," she said, her voice trembling. "Every chance I get," he promised, cupping her face. "Come back to me," she whispered. "I will." And then, he was gone. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Elizabeth adjusted to life without Matthew, but it was never the same. The bed felt too big, the house too quiet. But she remained strong, just as she had promised him. Every letter from Matthew became her treasure. She would sit by the window, reading them over and over again. His words kept her going, reminding her that even though they were miles apart, their love had not changed. They talked whenever they could, through brief phone calls, and on rare special days through video calls. The moment she saw his face, the loneliness melted away. "I miss you, Liz," Matthew would say, his face tired but his eyes filled with love. "I miss you more," she would reply, pressing her fingers against the screen, wishing she could touch him. The neighbors rallied around Elizabeth, making sure she was never alone. Neighbors stopped by, bringing her food, inviting her over for tea, keeping her company when the nights felt too long. Still, deep inside, she counted down the days until Matthew would come home. Their love was strong. Their bond was unbreakable. The nights were the hardest. The silence of the camp, the distant sounds of gunfire in a land far from home, and the weight of exhaustion pressing down on Matthew's shoulders. The peacekeeping mission had turned out to be more challenging than he expected. Long hours, unpredictable dangers, and worst of all, the terrible network that kept him disconnected from the one person who made everything feel worth it: Elizabeth. When the network was good, he would cling to every word she spoke over the phone, memorizing the way she laughed, the softness in her voice when she told him she loved him. But lately, calls had become rare, messages left unread, and silence had started to feel like a stranger in their marriage. Then one evening, a soldier named Jonas sat next to him. "Matt," Jonas said carefully, lowering his voice. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but I think you deserve to know." Matthew tensed, his gut twisting before he even heard the words. "My wife is friends with Elizabeth, or at least she was," Jonas continued. "I don't know how to say this, but she's been seen at clubs, dancing. And not just dancing, Matt. She's been spending time with other men." The words hit Matthew like a bullet straight to the chest. "What?" His voice came out sharp, disbelieving. Jonas sighed. "I'm not trying to hurt you, man. But my wife says it's been going on for a while. She didn't want to say anything, but you're my brother out here. I thought you should hear it from me, not from someone else." Matthew stood up abruptly, his heart pounding. No, that's not possible, not Elizabeth." He reached for his phone, his hands shaking as he tried to call her. No signal. He tried again, nothing. The network had never felt more cruel. For the next few days, the seed of doubt planted in Matthew's mind began to grow. The silence from Elizabeth, the missed messages, the calls that never went through, it all started to feel like a sign. And yet he fought against it. "She wouldn't do that to me. We love each other. We are stronger than this." When he finally managed to get a call through, his heart was racing. Elizabeth's voice came through the line, shaky and breathless. "Matthew?" He clenched his jaw. "Liz, I heard something today. I need you to tell me the truth. Are you dancing in clubs?" Silence. Then her voice rushed and defensive. "What? No! Who told you that? That's ridiculous!" Matthew exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. He wanted to believe her, but the doubt refused to leave. "I just need to hear you say it," he said, his voice rough. "Matty, I am home, waiting for you. You know me better than that." He swallowed hard, nodding, even though she couldn't see him. "She's right," he told himself. "I do know her. She would never." But he needed more reassurance. He needed to hear it from someone he could trust. That night, Matthew called Mark, his cousin, his brother in all but blood, the one person he had left in charge of checking up on Elizabeth while he was gone. "Mark," he said, the moment his cousin picked up, "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. Have you heard anything strange about Lizzie?" There was a pause before Mark sighed. "Matt, listen to me. Elizabeth loves you. She hasn't done anything wrong. People talk, you know that. But I've been checking up on her like you asked. She is completely innocent. I think I would know if she is having affairs with other men." Matthew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Are you sure?" His voice was low. "I swear on everything," Mark said firmly. "She's been waiting for you here diligently. Don't let rumors ruin what you two have." Matthew closed his eyes, relief washing over him. Mark had never lied to him before. If he said Elizabeth was faithful, then she was. "I believe you," Matthew said at last. "I believe her." Matthew sat by the fire with Jonas, the flickering flames casting long shadows over their faces. Jonas was quiet, studying him, waiting for a response. "I'm telling you, Matt," Jonas finally said, shaking his head. "I wouldn't lie to you about something like this." Matthew let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck. He had heard enough, but deep inside he refused to let the doubt take hold. "I appreciate you looking out for me," Matthew said, his voice calm but firm. "But you don't know Elizabeth like I do. She would never do that." Jonas sighed, clearly unconvinced. "I hope you're right, brother." Matthew forced a smile. "I am. This is just women's talk, you know how it is. People love to gossip. Jonas gave him a look but didn't argue further. Matthew clung to his conviction. Elizabeth was waiting for him. He refused to believe otherwise. Weeks later, the news came. Matthew had been granted a short leave, a 2-week holiday back home. It was all he had wanted. The journey felt endless, but when the plane finally landed, his heart pounded in his chest. Would she be there? Would she look at him the same way? As he stepped out of the airport, he barely had time to take a breath before he saw her. Elizabeth. She was standing there, her eyes locked onto his, filled with relief and something else, love deep and pure, just like before. Then she was in his arms. "You're here," she whispered against his chest, her fingers gripping his jacket tightly. "I'm here," he murmured back, pressing a kiss into her hair. "And I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in months, everything felt right. Those 2 weeks were like a dream. They spent long afternoons at the city park, sitting beneath the big tree, talking about everything and nothing. They cooked together, laughed over old memories, and spent quiet nights wrapped in each other's arms, just as if no time had passed. Elizabeth never once acted distant. She never gave him a reason to doubt. And so Matthew never brought up the rumors. He chose to trust her. He chose to believe in their love. Mark visited often, smiling and joking as always. Nothing seemed out of place. Matthew felt foolish for ever doubting her. Jonas had been wrong. As his leave drew to a close, they stood at the park one last time, watching the sunset. "You'll be back soon?" Elizabeth asked softly, holding onto his hand. "As soon as I can," Matthew promised. She smiled, pressing her forehead against his. "Then I'll be waiting." With one last deep kiss, they said goodbye. As Matthew boarded the plane back to duty, he felt lighter than he had in months. He had been wrong to doubt. Their love was stronger than any rumor. Or so he thought. Matthew returned to duty with a lighter heart and a mind at peace. Those 2 weeks back home had given him everything he needed: Elizabeth's love, her reassurances, and the feeling that nothing had changed. He had doubted her once before, but now he was sure. They were strong. Their love was real. No rumor could shake that. The days passed in the camp, routine settling back in. But then one evening, something felt off. As Matthew walked past a group of lower-ranked soldiers, he caught them huddled around a phone, whispering and laughing under their breath. At first, he thought nothing of it. Soldiers needed distractions. Everyone had their own way of escaping the pressure of war. But the moment they noticed him, they went silent. One of them, a young private, quickly tucked his phone away, exchanging nervous glances with the others. Matthew frowned. "What's going on?" Nothing, sir," one of them stammered. "Just stupid stuff." He wasn't convinced, but he let it go. Until later that night. As Matthew sat in his bunk, Jonas approached him, phone in hand, an uneasy look on his face. "Matt, I need you to see something." Matthew stiffened. Not this again, no more rumors. Jonas hesitated before handing him the phone. "I wasn't going to say anything, but after what happened earlier with the guys, I think you should see this for yourself." Matthew took the phone, and the moment his eyes landed on the screen, his heart dropped. It was Elizabeth. The video was shaky, taken in a dimly lit nightclub. She was dancing, but not just dancing, moving in ways that made his stomach turn. Her dress was short, too short. The way she swayed, the way men around her stared, it didn't look good. His breath caught in his throat. His Elizabeth, his wife, at a nightclub like this. He gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. Jonas placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't know what's going on, Matt, but this isn't a rumor. This is real." Matthew couldn't breathe. Everything inside him screamed no. This wasn't Elizabeth. This wasn't the woman he left behind. There had to be an explanation. He had to hear it from her. His hands shook as he dialed the video call. It rang once, twice. Then, she answered. Matthew? Elizabeth's face lit up, her smile warm, as if nothing was wrong. I've been waiting for you to call. His chest tightened. How could she act so normal? Elizabeth, he said, his voice hard, betrayal thick in his tone. Tell me the truth. Were you at a club? Her smile faltered. What? Matt, what are you talking about? She said, but he saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. I saw it, he said through clenched teeth. A video of you dancing in town. Her face paled. Who sent you that? That doesn't matter, Matthew snapped. I need to hear it from you. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. Okay, yes, I went, but it wasn't what you think. Matthew felt like the ground beneath him was slipping. Then what was it, Elizabeth? She bit her lip, looking away before meeting his eyes again. It was just for a friend's birthday, she finally admitted. I just wanted to loosen up a little. Matt, you've been gone for so long. I was lonely. I didn't do anything wrong. His mind raced. She was lonely. She missed him. Maybe he had overreacted. Maybe he was being too hard on her. She must have seen the doubt in his eyes because she pressed on. I swear it was just dancing, she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. I didn't do anything beyond that. I just needed to blow off some steam. Silence. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to believe her. Matt, she whispered, leaning closer to the screen. Please, don't let this come between us. He let out a slow, heavy breath. All right, he finally said. She relaxed, relief flooding her face. I believe you, he added, though his own voice felt hollow. But deep down, something still didn't sit right. The war had changed him. For 2 years, Matthew had been deployed on a classified mission, one so secretive that he had been completely cut off from the world. No letters, no calls, no messages. Nothing. At first, it had been unbearable. Not knowing if Elizabeth was okay, not hearing her voice, not being able to tell her that he was alive, that he was fighting to come back to her. But as time passed, he learned to numb the ache. He buried himself in duty and survival, mission after mission, battle after battle, until finally, it was over. And now, after 2 years, he was going home. Mark was waiting for him at the airport, grinning wide as he pulled Matthew into a tight embrace. Man, it's good to see you, Mark said, clapping his back. It's good to be back, Matthew replied, his chest swelling with emotions he couldn't quite put into words. The ride home felt surreal. Everything looked the same, but Matthew felt different. He stared out of the window, taking in the streets of his childhood, the familiar houses, the people who had always been part of his world. I know she's going to be so happy to see me, Matthew finally said, breaking the silence. Mark smiled knowingly. Yeah, it's nice to have someone special waiting for you. She must have missed you a lot. Matthew exhaled, his fingers tightening around his knee. I don't know how I went by those 2 lonely years without her. His voice was thick with both excitement and nervousness. Mark nodded. It's over now, man. You're home. A small smile played on Matthew's lips. He was home, and he couldn't wait to see her. As they neared his neighborhood, Mark glanced at him. So, straight home? Matthew hesitated, then shook his head. No, he said, a grin forming. I want to surprise her. Mark raised an eyebrow. Surprise her? Where? The park, Matthew said instantly. She always spends her Saturdays there. That's where she'll be. Mark chuckled. Man, after all this time, you still know her routines better than she does. Matthew smirked. Some things never change. Mark took a turn, heading towards the park. Well, she's gonna freak out when she sees you. Matthew's heart pounded. That's what he wanted. To see her face light up, to hold her again, to tell her that he was back for good. He could already picture it. The park was just as he remembered it. The gentle rustling of the trees, the soft whispers of the wind, the distant laughter of families enjoying the day. And then, he saw her. She was right there, sitting under the same tree where they had once promised forever. Her back was turned to him, her hair falling gently over her shoulders. Matthew felt a wave of relief wash over him. She was still here. She was still his. His steps quickened. He could already picture the moment. Her turning around, her eyes widening in shock, the way she would throw herself into his arms. But then he saw him. A man, sitting close, too close. His hand rested on her thigh. Matthew's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed no. Then Elizabeth laughed. A laugh so carefree, so familiar, the same laugh she used to share with him. And before Matthew could move, before he could even breathe, the man leaned in and kissed her, right there, under their tree, under the same branches that had once sheltered their love. The world tilted beneath Matthew's feet. His hands clenched into fists, his heart shattered into pieces. Everything froze. His Elizabeth, his wife, with someone else. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out every sound around him. She had moved on. While he had been away, risking his life, fighting to survive, counting the days until he could see her again, she had replaced him. Matthew stood frozen, his body rigid with shock, his heart in pieces. The love of his life, the woman he had fought for, survived for, dreamed about every single day. He could still hear her soft laugh, the way she looked at the man, the way she leaned into him. His stomach churned. I risked my life for her, and this is how she repays me. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He needed to hear it. He needed to know without a doubt that everything he had believed in was a lie. He dialed Elizabeth's number. She was so close, just a few feet away, yet she had no idea her past and present were about to collide. The phone rang once, twice, and then she answered. "Hey, baby," she said sweetly, her voice soft, warm, familiar. The voice he had longed for through 2 years of war and silence. Matthew clenched his jaw. "Where are you?" Elizabeth didn't even hesitate. "Home," she lied effortlessly. "Just resting. It's been a long day." His chest tightened. "Yeah." His voice was dangerously calm. "Are you alone?" "Of course," she said, still lying. "It's just me." Matthew swallowed back the fury burning in his throat. There it was. The final nail in the coffin. The moment their love officially died. He took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. "It's okay," he murmured into the phone. "I already found you." Elizabeth froze. He watched as she stiffened, her entire body going rigid. Slowly she turned around, and when her eyes met his, all the color drained from her face. For a long moment no one moved. The man beside her looked between them, confused, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Matthew. "Matt." Elizabeth's voice came out as a whisper, shaken, terrified. Matthew held her gaze, his betrayal, his pain, his fury all laid bare in his eyes. "You lied," he said. His voice was eerily calm, but his heart was screaming. "Matt, I don't." He cut her off, his tone sharp like a blade. "Don't you dare." She quickly got to her feet, frantic now. "It's not what you think." He let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow. "Not what I think." He gestured around them. "I just watched another man kiss my wife under our tree, Liz. What exactly am I supposed to think?" The man beside her shifted uncomfortably, realizing the weight of the moment. "Hey, man, maybe we should talk." Matthew's glare snapped at him, making him flinch. "Stay out of this." The man held up his hands in surrender and stepped back. Matthew turned his attention back to Elizabeth, his eyes burning into hers. 2 years, he said, his voice low, heavy with pain. 2 damn years, Elizabeth. Do you know what I went through? What I survived? And the whole time all I could think about was you. Coming back to you." Her eyes filled with tears. "I thought you were never coming back," she blurted out. "You were gone, Matt. No letters, no calls, no nothing. I didn't know if you were dead or alive." His chest heaved. "So that's your excuse?" "It's not like that," she pleaded. "Then tell me what it is," he challenged, stepping closer. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because there was nothing left to say. The damage was done. Matthew took a deep breath, staring at her one last time, memorizing the face of the woman he once loved. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Matthew walked away from the park without looking back. Every step felt heavy, like he was carrying the weight of every broken promise, every lost dream, every lie. By the time he reached the car, his chest ached, his throat was tight, his hands clenched into fists. Mark was leaning against the car, waiting. But the moment he saw Matthew's face, pale, eyes dark with betrayal, he straightened. Matt. Mark's voice was hesitant, cautious. Matthew didn't say a word. He yanked the car door open and slid inside, staring straight ahead, his mind replaying the image of Elizabeth with another man. Mark got in beside him, letting the silence sit between them for a moment. Then he sighed, shaking his head. "I swear, Matt, I didn't know." His voice was firm, but filled with guilt. "If I had, man, I would have told you. You know that." Matthew exhaled sharply, leaning his head against the seat. "All this time," he muttered, "I was fighting for her, Mark, surviving for her, and she—" His voice broke and he stopped talking. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight. "I don't know what to say, man. I'm sorry." The words felt empty. There was nothing left to say. Mark sighed, rubbing his face before starting the car. "Come on, let's go home." Matthew didn't respond. He just stared out of the window, empty, shattered. As they pulled into the familiar neighborhood, Matthew felt like a stranger in his own world. The houses looked the same, the streets were just as he left them, but everything was different now. Mark parked in front of the house. But before Matthew could step out, his eyes landed on something unexpected. A child. A little boy. Standing at the front door, staring at the car with wide, curious eyes. Matthew blinked. His exhausted mind couldn't process it. "Who's that?" he asked slowly, his voice quiet, hesitant. Beside him, Mark stiffened. Then he exhaled deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Matt, there's something I need to tell you," Mark said carefully. Matthew's chest tightened. "What?" Mark sighed again, then nodded towards the boy. "His name is Desmond," he said. "Elizabeth had him while you were away." Matthew's heart stopped. His eyes snapped to Mark, his breath catching in his throat. Elizabeth had a child. His mind swirled with emotions, shock, confusion, disbelief. She was pregnant, he whispered, his voice barely there. Mark nodded. "Yeah. And she never told you." Matthew turned back to the boy, his stomach twisting, his heart pounding. Desmond was small, no more than a year old. And God, he looked like him. Something inside Matthew shifted. The pain, the betrayal. It was still there, but now there was something else. Something new. Something good. His feet moved before his mind could catch up. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the boy, his heart beating harder with every step. Desmond looked up at him with big, innocent eyes. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then the boy smiled. Matthew felt something break open inside him. He crouched down, his hands shaking as he reached out. "Hey there, buddy," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Desmond took a step closer, looking at him curiously. Then, to Matthew's complete shock, the little boy reached out and placed a tiny hand on his face. Matthew froze. And then, for the first time since stepping off that plane, he smiled. Because despite the chaos, despite the heartbreak, this child was here, and he was his. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Matthew sat on the couch that night, Desmond curled up in his lap, fast asleep. He stared down at the small boy, his son. Or at least, that's what he wanted to believe. Tears burned his eyes as he gently ran a hand over the boy's soft curls. He should have been there for his birth. The weight of betrayal, love, and confusion sat heavy on his chest. He had lost Elizabeth, that much was clear, but Desmond was innocent in all of this. The only good thing to come out of this nightmare, and Matthew couldn't walk away, not from him. But the doubts wouldn't let him rest. All night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The rumors, the accusations, the whispers of her being with other men. Had Desmond really been his all along? Or had he been fooling himself? By morning, he needed answers. And if Elizabeth wouldn't give them to him, he'd find them himself. When she left the house that morning, Matthew watched her go without a word. Then he moved. Heart pounding, he sat at her desk and turned on her computer. For a moment, his hands hovered over the keyboard. Then he began to search. Emails, messages, social media. And with every click, his worst fears came true. There they were. Messages from men, explicit, familiar. Some even from names he recognized. Pictures, receipts, proof of everything he had refused to believe. Elizabeth hadn't just moved on while he was away. She had been living an entirely different life. She had been lying to him for years, working as a stripper, engaging in relationships with multiple men. And the most crushing part? Some of these messages dated back to before he even left. His breath shook as he scrolled, his chest burning with a pain so deep he thought it might kill him. The woman he loved, the woman he had fought for, survived for, had never been faithful to him at all. And Desmond, his hands trembled as he stared at the child's name in some of the messages. There were discussions, doubts, conversations about who the father really was. Matthew's world spun. Was he even Desmond's father? The thought alone nearly brought him to his knees. When Elizabeth returned that evening, Matthew was waiting. She stepped inside, smiling slightly, but froze the moment she saw his face. He stood by the desk, the open laptop screen glowing with the undeniable truth. Elizabeth, his voice was dangerously low. I know everything. Her face drained of color. Matthew? He cut her off. I found the messages, he said, his voice sharp. The photos, the receipts, all of it. She swallowed, her hands shaking. I can explain. Explain what? Matthew snapped. That you've been sleeping with other men. That you've been lying to me for years. His voice grew colder. I thought we could patch things up because of Desmond, he said, but I was wrong. He took a step back, his eyes hard, unyielding. I'm done, Elizabeth, I want a divorce. She gasped, tears filling her eyes. Matthew, please, we can fix this. He shook his head. No, we can't. Her breath hitched. Desmond needs you. Does he? Matthew's voice was hollow. Or is that another lie? Elizabeth went silent. That was all he needed to know. The doubt was real, and this marriage was over. Without another word, Matthew turned and walked away. The courtroom was silent. Matthew sat stiffly in his chair, his fists clenched on his lap, his heart hammering so loudly he could barely hear anything else. Across from him, Elizabeth looked pale, fragile, like she already knew what was coming. But Matthew wasn't looking at her. His eyes were on Desmond. The little boy sat on a bench with a court assistant, happily playing with a small toy. Matthew swallowed hard. He had convinced himself he was ready for this. But now, sitting here, waiting for the judge to read the results, he wasn't sure anymore. What if he really wasn't Desmond's father? What if the last piece of happiness he had wasn't even his to hold on to? The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence. In the case of Carter versus Carter, he began, his voice firm, emotionless, concerning the paternity of Desmond Carter. Matthew held his breath. The DNA results have concluded that... A pause. A long, agonizing pause. Matthew's entire body went cold. Mr. Carter, you are not the biological father of Desmond Carter. The words hit like a bullet. A sharp, unbearable pain tore through his chest, leaving him gasping for air. It felt like the walls of the courtroom were closing in on him. The one thing, the one person he thought he could hold on to in this chaos was never his. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his world spinning. Desmond. The child he had spent nights holding, thinking he had found a reason to stay. The child who had reached out for him, trusting him without question. The child who wasn't his. The realization hit so hard he nearly doubled over. A choked sob broke through the silence. Matthew lifted his eyes to see Elizabeth trembling, tears streaming down her face. She was completely broken now. The weight of everything she had done, the lies, the betrayal, the loss, it had finally crashed down on her. I'm sorry, Matthew, she whispered. I never meant for it to be like this. Matthew felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even hatred, just emptiness. He looked at Desmond again, the boy he had loved as his own. His chest ached, but he knew this was the end. The judge let out a heavy sigh. Due to the overwhelming evidence of infidelity and deception, the court grants the divorce in favor of Mr. Carter, he declared. The gavel hit the table. A sound so final, so permanent, that it sent a sharp pain straight to Matthew's heart. It was over. The love he thought would last forever. The family he believed was his. All of it. Gone. Matthew stood slowly, his legs numb, his body heavy. Elizabeth sobbed into her hands, but he didn't look at her. There was nothing left to say. He turned, walked past the courtroom benches, past the legal clerks, past the life he once had, and stepped out into the world alone. Free, but more broken than he had ever been before. Matthew tried. He tried to forget. Tried to leave it all in the past. The betrayal, the lies, the love that was never real. He buried himself in work, taking on extra shifts, pushing his body to the limit. Anything to drown out the memories. But the nights were the worst. The quiet. The thoughts creeping in like a slow poison, whispering all the what-ifs and could-have been. 2 years of war had not broken him. But Elizabeth did. And no matter how much he tried to act like he was moving forward, the scars wouldn't fade. Weeks passed. Then months. He barely spoke to anyone outside of work. Mark tried to get him to open up, but Matthew couldn't. What was there to say? He had given everything to a woman who never truly belonged to him. He had risked his life for a family that never existed. He had fought for nothing. Then, one evening, everything changed. Matthew had just returned home, exhausted from another long day, when his phone buzzed. A message. From an unknown number. His brows furrowed as he stared at the screen. Matthew, there's something you need to know. It's about Elizabeth and Desmond. Meet me at the park tomorrow. It's urgent. His breath caught in his throat. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Who was this? What more could there be to know? His first instinct was to ignore it. He was done with Elizabeth, done with the past. But Desmond, the boy who was never his but who still haunted his thoughts. What if there was more? What if this was his chance to finally get the truth? Matthew clenched his jaw. He didn't want to go. But he knew he would. Because deep down, he needed answers. One last time, to be continued. Will Matthew uncover the final secrets of Elizabeth's betrayal? Who is Desmond's real father? And what truth still waits in the shadows?